Well, welcome everybody. Oh, it's wonderful to see you. I'm so glad you're here with us for this special occasion. And Kafi had thought that it was on Martin Luther King Day. And so she's adjusting and making her way here. So she'll be joining us very soon.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I am joined in doing this conversation with James and Kafi by my dear friend and colleague, Melissa Hoffer, who some of you know. And we're all given the chance, obviously, this morning to reflect on this incredible film, A Reckoning in Boston, with James and Kafi, who are two of the three co-producers of the film. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, James, and we'll thank Kafi when she gets here. So James is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and I've really enjoyed getting a sense, James, of your larger body of work, which takes up so many challenges and disparities in American society in so many different ways. And, you know, maybe you'll tell us a little bit more about that. And Kafi is the founder of Boston's first worker and woman-owned urban farm co-op. And it's called the Common Good Co-op. And just to introduce Melissa, Melissa is the Deputy General Counsel of the EPA. And she's also a very proud goat farmer in Barre, Massachusetts. So I want to just start by saying, although I think we attempted in the advertising of this film to give you a sort of a holistic sense of it, this powerful film, this tender film, defies any kind of summary, I would say. And having now watched it 4 times, it really is continuing to open and in these layers reveal itself to me. So I'm quite humbled by that, James. Just saying that doesn't happen very often. That is such a layered work and so profound. So with the film, you're welcome. Thank you. You know, we enter through the Clementi Humanities course, and we have actually a few people here who are either running the program or have taught in it for years. So I'm really glad to welcome Amy Richter and Ruth Smith to our gathering. And we draw from the wisdom and provocations and the community that you help us see about Clementi. And then we're invited into the lives of Kafi and Carl and get a sense of their insight and caring and persistence and commitment, and see some of what they live and continue to face in the systemic racism and misogyny and corruption and exploitation that exists in that world, in Boston, in this very strongly local place. Hi, Kafi, yay. Good to see you.
Hi, James. Thank you all for being so patient.
Oh, thank you for joining us now at this, you know, without having the timing be clear. So it's really great.
That was my part. So I do appreciate your patience. So thank you all.
Thank you. So good
to be here with you.
Yeah. I'm just doing a little bit of a welcome and just introduced Melissa and James and you also as founder of Boston's first worker and woman-owned urban farm co-op, the Common Good Co-op. And I was just saying, this incredible film, really, the layers of it, how it continues to unfold as you spend time with it. So I was partly saying we were invited into your life and Carl's life and the commitment and insight and care and commitment that, well, and the persistence that you show in your lives and what you face in terms of the systemic conditions in our world and in your world. And also we see the history of the city, the attitudes, the recurring violence that's woven through the film as a kind of foundation, actually, for how this is continuing. So it's also, and one more comment, it's also possible after we let all of this in to step back and see that your story is an embodiment of the confluence of the human behaviors that are destabilizing the planet. And that brings it really to the work that we do in the Council on the Uncertain Human Future. So it's all of this, and it's also this very profoundly moving local story of your life, Kafi, and Carl's life, and how James came to be part of that in the work of making the film. So I'm going to start with, we have some questions, Melissa and I do, for both of you. So I'm going to start by asking both of you, either of you could speak first. It seems like the making of the film in itself was a process of transformation for you both. And so I wonder if you can speak to your journeys and how Kafi and Carl came to be not just the subjects of the film, but also co-producers of the films. So maybe, James, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And Melissa and everyone who's here today. Thanks so much for being here on a Sunday morning. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, what happened was the film, to my mind, started out being about the transformative transformation through engagement with arts and humanities, literature, philosophy, and history. And that was back in 2014 when I first brought a crew into the classroom and got a huge welcome from the Clemente team in Boston and Dorchester, and full access to the classroom, and the goodwill of all the teachers in the program. And so over the course of that year, we were filming, I think we filmed like 7 classes. And I had in mind that it would be a story mostly set in the classroom about this experience of the humanities. And over that year, it was that January that I actually first really had a long conversation with Kafi. And we met, and Kafi, you were so open to me, and the conversation was so full of trust and goodwill, but at the same time, so revelatory for me in hearing about your life. And I also was noting in class that Carl was a very strong presence in the classroom, and that he was basically a self-educated person who was really an intellectual. I mean, I think both Kafi and Carl are intellectuals in a way that, in different ways. And so I got interested in them as people, and we started spending time together, and we started doing some filming that winter, and then continued over the next year. And I think part of what happened, I mean, what really happened was that I started seeing, we became friends over time, and so that relationship as being an outsider got blurred a little bit, and I wasn't just this observer that I wanted to be initially. It became more complicated, especially as Kafi very graciously brought me into her life experiences and into this almost parallel society. I think of it as that where she lived and I live, and Kafi understood that and wanted me to see more of her lived experience. And so Kafi invited me to the housing agency, the welfare agency, and to housing court. And I spent, and over time, I began to see that, yes, I began to understand that the premise of the film, which was, it's a powerful idea, and it is true that the humanities do transform people. Like, serious engagement with art and literature and philosophy is powerful, and does, as the Clemente anyone in Clemente will tell you that it is transformative for people. But at the same time, I started to recognize that as soon as Kafi and Carl leave that classroom and go out into the world, like the world has not been transformed, right? The world, what they experience every day is, within these structures and systems that are sort of intransient in a way, or felt that way. As I began to understand it, and I realized that the film had to be more than just the experience of of what happened in a classroom. And then later on, as we continued to work together, it went on for more than the year that I anticipated. It was like 5 years of making this idea that there are these structures and systems that Kafi and Carl live in I think we together began to recognize that, and I began to recognize that I'm part of that system too. And so like, this was not just Kafi and Carl's story or the Clemente student story, it was all our stories. And I did not want to be part of the film or be a voice or character or any of that, but Kafi really encouraged me, and as did Nolan Walker at ITBS and some other people of color who were saying to me, look, your voice matters. And at the same time, it was getting that voice right and using my presence to bring a sharper relief to the stories of Kafi and Carl, rather than creating some new story about myself, but using my voice to illuminate their stories is so that was sort of the full trajectory of how things went.
Thank you. Thank you. Kafi, what would you say to that question?
I remember being in class and seeing James sitting in the corner and being curious about what he was doing. But as with most of our lives, outside of these snippets of awareness or realization, you go back into your own personal world. But in thinking, when James asking Carl and I to be part of the documentary, a large portion of it was, for me, I can't speak for Carl, but I traveled through this life. I don't want to say that I'm marginalized, but as a woman, I traveled through this life. As a woman of color, I traveled through this life. And often we pass people and we have no idea what their lived experience is. And here I was creating something that was based off of a positive showing of my lived experience around access to healthy environments, healthy communities, healthy food, and how that had impacted me mentally, physically, and emotionally. And that I was creating something for women, a community of women who that was not their lived experience, who they may have touched that community, but no longer had access to it, or a tangible access that would create a connection to this work. So here I was creating something that I felt that philosophy said was just and good. But the pushback from a city, a municipality, was that it was not just, nor was it good. And I had such a difficult time reconciling that and feeling a fear, a real fear around not just what would happen to the project, but in pushing this conversation about what is just and good for individuals, a community, an environment, right? Feeling a real fear that I was pushing back up against powers that would have preferred that those conversations were not initiated. So in thinking, I was that the project, and a real fear that the violence around, the very real violence that was documented in the documentary and that James witnessed and that I personally was experiencing and didn't know how to talk about, I said that if this project should disappear and I should disappear, that can James and his camera, as James would say, be a moral witness? So a lot of our relationship and coming into the documentary was allowing James into my life and the lives of other Black women who have a generational relationship with this country as African Americans, and how our communities are often not connected. But could James and his willingness to better understand us, and with this camera, document the good that we try to do in our community and the forces that stop it.
Thank you. Melissa.
Well, good morning, James and Kafi, and thank you so much, Sarah. Kafi, I was thinking, watching the film, we have heard so much recently about just the concept of resilience, climate resilience and social resilience and community resilience. And, the film documents, there's so much vulnerability in it and all of the adversity that you have faced. And I'm wondering, to what do you attribute your own resilience? And in your experience, what makes communities more resilient?
What made me resilient, I think there were two things in particular. One, what kept me sustaining in a determination was purely that I was offended. I was extremely offended. And a lot of people thought it was anger. A lot of people thought it was frustration, but it was agency. But it was agency and being offended. And what brought me into this work that oftentimes we talk about and is shown in the documentary, a portion of that was Thompson's Island. But even before Thompson's Island, of me talking about forging my name, something happened before that, which two women, Annie Hoffman and Myrna Johnson, Annie Hoffman of Arlington, Massachusetts, who's a yoga instructor. But when she was a younger woman, seeing my mother with these children, and my mother as a single parent being overwhelmed, and as far as Annie is concerned, not necessarily knowing how to help my mother, but understanding to be able to take her daughters out of the home and take us on these long trips to Bar Harbor, Maine, with Stevie Nicks playing on the radio. And I'm still a Stevie Nicks fan, Fleetwood Mac to this day. And on this highway, being two little girls in the backseat looking out of the window at these huge pine trees and being very aware how the air smelled different. There wasn't trash that was strewn about like it was on Clarkson Street in the Bowdoin Street area where we lived at the time. Walking on the beach, doing yoga in the morning, sun salutations. So we weren't necessarily supposed to know that life existed and was possible. And I encourage us all, because Toga and I, we are still friends. We've been friends since we were 11. I encourage you all to think about how offensive it can be to communities when we do go into certain communities which are not necessarily integrated, and we can feel in that moment what it is to be in that peace and that beauty that is curated around a resiliency for the people who are able to afford to live there. When we think about the vineyard, when we think about Wellfleet, when we think about Chautauqua, when we think about the only privatized island in Boston Harbor, which is Thompson's Island. I think it's one of the few privatized islands. So the resilience came from knowing that these places existed, and the agency came from how they always impacted my life, access to spaces that were curated around well-being, and what that meant for women who didn't necessarily have access to it, but we're not even knocking down the doors to get into other people's spaces of well-being. But through me and my work, we're participating in creating spaces of their own well-being. So when I think about resilience, I mean, in the truest sense of the word, not resilience that's written into a grant, not resilience that's written into an article. I mean, when Indigenous and African-American people talk about resilience in an American society, we're talking about a determination to live. And if we look at philosophy, we're saying a determination to flourish. And the agency and the determination to not just live, but to flourish and well-being was something that created my own resiliency. That this was going to be created regardless. And I think if we can create more spaces, because think about it, and coming to the end of this statement, think about places where Black and Brown can really say, we've been resilient, untethered, unchallenged. This is a space of resiliency. Resiliency exists for us internally, but there are few facets where you can ask a Black woman, an African-American woman, or an Indigenous man, please show us where there is resiliency for you, where there is a success around your own personal determinations to live, thrive, and flourish. And there's a disconnection a lot of people, Black and Brown people, cannot. And that's also the disconnect to the climate, to the environment.
I remember at one Q&A, we were talking about this idea of resiliency, and the Kafi, you raised this idea that, like, well, why is resiliency constantly required of us? Like, what would the world look like if there wasn't this constant pressing need to be resilient on your part?
We've always made a private joke within our community of brown women, like, and I've always made, I don't feel the need to bring that. I see the council here as moving towards resolution. So some of our audiences are looking for resolution. They're looking to better understand. And then some of our audiences, like the council, are doing the work and are looking for more tools in this kit to be effective and to be inclusive. So I'll bring a different conversation into the space. But typically for people who I know are not inclusive and are not concerned, I ask them what it is to ask communities to be resilient, to continue to put them in a situation, in an oppressive situation where you're demanding their resiliency. What it is to put the foot on someone's neck and thank them for standing back up, and then knock them down again and thank them for standing back up. In autonomy, there is already a self-guiding, again, resiliency towards not just living or thriving, but flourishing. But when you're knocked down, in the case of a small lot that is a garden that the city wants to call an urban farm, what is it to say, Kafi, we commend you for being able to bring the project forward without looking at the people who stopped and challenged and created a violent situation around planting eggplants.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. And I'm thinking of the scene where you're in the car with Toga, and you're talking about the time that you spent on Thompson Island when you guys were both kids and you wanted to be a marine biologist. And there's this wonderful few lines, Kafi, where you say that, you would go to that land for peace, and that you just literally went to Thompson Island because that was a safe space, and that there was a healing power to those safe spaces. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit to, how you think about the healing power of land, and that safe space, and how did it shape who you are, and what do you see as the potential for the women who are a part of Common Good?
Yeah, so it's something I'm a visual person. So in remembering Thompson's Island, I remembered, we grew up swimming, thank God. My mom, luckily my father's from Newton, Massachusetts, and my mother's from Melrose, Massachusetts. So we are stone cold New Englanders. But I remember, we didn't feel like we were impoverished, but we were. And my mom dealt with her own mental health issues. So there was a bit of abuse in the house, or neglect, I should say. There was a bit of neglect that created these things that were going on in the house that I necessarily didn't understand as a child. And then to go to school and to be victimized by a racial bias, right? And a bigotry that, thank goodness, we're talking about now. But at the time, to be a little Black girl in the last row of a classroom at Taft Middle School in Brighton, and to feel as a part of the MECO program, to be reinforced that was not a safe space for you, right? By some of the behaviors of the instructors, which also guided me to go back to school later in life. But I remember going to Thompson's Island and getting in the water and swimming. Going down to the sand. And they were just cleaning the harbor, thank goodness to the Kennedys. So I don't know what we were swimming in, but it didn't matter, right? I don't know what we were swimming in. But I remember, if you can honestly understand, these children and these camp counselors who are also brown people in this water on these beaches swimming, and then how you take rocks and you clink them together. And even in what you think is a deafening silence, you can hear that. And how the world is blocked out, but is there around you in a different existence, right? So I often think about land, access to space, as an ability to design. Who are we to tell women that you don't have the ability or competency to not claim land, but to live on anything that you have designed for your own mental health and well-being? James had came into my house in Ashmont, and although I was living in the city and I had just returned from Connecticut, I don't even know if James realized that everything in that house, and in the houses of most women, even in their dishevelment, is curated to their well-being. There was a little brass giraffe that I glued over a light switch in the front hallway. There was a decoupage spoon that was decoupaged with pictures of strawberries. There were incense and sage, curtainless windows, because I had learned to just lay and look up at the sky to fall asleep and then wake by the sun, even if my job was traumatic enough. And what I say is, because we often don't go into houses of communities that are other than ours. We may not have the cultural competence to see how they are creating safe space. But that same determination to find wellness in our environment and spaces that we can control and call our own has the ability to scale in capacity through ownership and access and be realized. But we don't. If for the last 10 years from the Obama administration, we've been talking about land loss of African-American farmers, and think deeply, it was the farmers who were protecting the SNCC transportations into the South for voting rights. It was the farmers who were taking people in the middle of the night in safety on their land, because they knew that their land property rights legally provided them the same safety rights to white farmers. And there was some weird respect around that, Ben Burkett would tell us. So in allowing women as nurturers, as head of households, to have access to land, the same as they do globally. What does that look like? And I want to say this last part of traveling in St. Lucia, as we talk about climate change and we talk about environmental violence or environmental agency, I remember I travel now as an older woman. I couldn't when I was younger with children at the age of 17, because I want to know how other people are living. And it's not until you're living in a treehouse in St. Lucia, in a little village, and you have a bottle of oil, and you have to figure out where that oil goes, because there's no trash can. And the elder women in the village take the oil, take the bottle, re-clean it, reuse the bottle, and bring it to market to sell their castor oil. Do you start to become aware of our impact on the environment, but people who do have autonomy in their communities, what they do naturally for their own flourishment and for their communities around how they use resources. With every house in St. Lucia having a water bin, every single house. They don't throw things in the river because those rivers provide for them. So how do we connect women to land as safe space and provide them the ability to design not what party space looks like, not what dishevelment looks like and disorganization, but say to them, this is your space. Design it in the manner in which you think it should be. And we have yet to have an example of that, except for a class and a cultural example of that, except for that garden in Dorchester. I'd also like to say, Toga and I are here in Connecticut right now, and she's actually in the living room. She's a little bit dressed up because I'm taking her out to breakfast, but she'll.
Hey, Toga.
She's coming. I ate breakfast this morning, get dressed, but I was outside fixing my truck.
Oh my goodness.
Sit down. I just wanted to say hi. We were talking about Thompson's Island. You don't have to stay for a while, but.
Hey.
Hey, Toga.
You. Hey, how are you? The lashes are cultural, y'all. Y'all just gonna have to accept it. And one of these days I will get on with a pair of gold teeth too, because I'm dying to have the Black Southern woman gold auntie rims, because I deserve them. Everybody keeps saying, just get them. I said, I don't know if the audiences will understand culturally what lashes and gold teeth mean to Black women. But I also want to say lashes and gold teeth and extensions have never stopped Toga and I from getting out there and shoveling the soil and having a remembrance of Thompson's Island and taking very long walks with our coffees and our teas in Blue Hills Reservation.
Yeah.
And that's a marginalization that people wouldn't understand, that even though we're coming into Hartford to decompress, that we still are taking the long path out to get a coffee through Simsbury because you go over the mountains.
Beautiful.
And then we're going to the river to see if the river's frozen over and standing out there looking out the car window like, oh, it's moving too fast, so it's not gonna freeze. So those things, and then sharing with other friends that, oh, this was, imagine an Indigenous community living here in Simsbury, Connecticut, across this fast moving river and using it as refrigeration.
Mm-hmm.
Those are conversations we had yesterday, lashes and gold teeth and all. But some people would say that women like us, and there are many more women like us, don't conceptually take those things into considerations. And that's the failure of not bringing us into conversations around how we have more resilient, safe space communities, mm-hmm. and how we look at our environment and become stewards of it.
Amen. Amen.
I wasn't trying to make you sit here. I wanted her to give me her fluffy sweater. I was like, give me a hoodie.
Oh, it's cold. It's too cold. Oh my God.
Hang on to it.
I also drag her to work on political campaigns with me. I'm like, come on, let's go to a call bank. And there's all these union guys sitting there and we're making phone calls and she's looking at me. I'm just like,
It's introverted. I just,
yeah.
I'm leaving you guys.
Okay,
Bye.
go ahead.
Bye, Toga.
Thank you. We just have one more question as we get a little bit later in our time, and it sounds like that breakfast is beckoning too. So this is a big one at the end. And what you've been talking about, coffee, just leads right into it. I think thinking about what we learn about in the film, what is documented, what is revealed, what you live and experience, the systemic racism, the economic disparity, the violence, the ways that you're systemically restricted and discouraged. How do either of you, both of you actually, connect this world and reality that you've portrayed so powerfully in the film with what's happening now to the planet as a whole, its exploitation and the breakdown that's underway? How do you draw those connections? We even, of course, would love to hear what you're thinking about democracy, but I think either or. So how you're thinking about the relationships of what you shared in this film and the large situation, the parallel, the embodiment that it demonstrates for what's going on the planet as a whole.
What I ask people to do is not to think about what they see in the documentary, but deeply think about what we were trying to do, what I was trying to do on that land. Because still, I mean, we're up in Connecticut because I am moving back, coming back to Connecticut, the Western Mass, maybe Southern Vermont area, to advocate for a larger farm space, because I love Boston, but its grandeur is like oppressive. That's a garden. I have done rural farming and urban farming. And it's always, I sit in spaces, and it's funny because we also provide residency programs to Tuskegee students. So in my capacity with Sustainable Agriculture and Resource Enterprise, and looking at the portfolio of some of the projects that we funded, that it's so weird because we funded projects around sustainable agriculture and resource, knowing that that's the only time a POC or a woman of POC would be on that site to talk about bee flora, or creating management systems around runoff for cattle, waste and animal waste, or talking about building creeks through forests on people's for that of what it will look like for more land, then it may be a dream that I'm not able to, it will be realized, but I may not be physically by the time that point able, I will just be creating space again that I don't know at my age of, at the age of 50, how much time there will be for me to get out on a tractor, or to not even on a tractor, but to practice land mitigation ways and to teach other women in a way that I can see the fruition of what we grow, what we propagate. But to think about what we were trying to do. Because as I shared with Sarah, what the documentary doesn't show was I was trying to create an environmentally sustaining urban farm. Initially, I went in very wide-eyed, thinking about a zero waste urban farm. I thought about meeting a professor who lives in Maine now, who travels globally, teaching people how to build their own solar panels out of like glass and crayon. It's wild and it's beautiful. But I thought what it would look like to, once I did purchase the house, after we received the land, I thought what it would look like to have solar panels and to create a micro space within a neighborhood where even leaving, and James knows this, leaving from Ashmont and moving to Four Corners, less than a half a mile, but they're two vastly different communities, and Four Corners is not a walkable community. If you ever go through Four Corners, there's so much trash there, I don't even know where it comes from. But it's also unlike, to talk about what equity looks like. It's also a low homeowner occupied neighborhood. So where Ashmont Hill is high owner occupied, and there's equity enough in the community to think about their trash, how they use their trash, the cleanliness of their neighborhood, recycling, water issues, right? Gardening, and relegating people to rental units, there's not that same equity in the community. But if we can't have equity through home ownership, we can have equity through participating in green space. And that's a challenge. So on that site, I was trying to just, because I was aware of zero waste. I mean, I go to Vermont. I've been to these places in Cambridge. I watch PBS. I understand. I've watched documentaries where in coastal towns in Africa, it's nothing but bottles. And you see fishermen pulling into these polluted rivers and waterways. So, and thinking about how do we create those same issues. But we were talking about owl houses as a way to deal with rodent control if there were any rodent issues on the farm site while we were growing. We were talking about bat houses to deal with any bats that would come into this space. And this is before SARE. So we understood that we had the ability naturally to create a space. And I wanted that space for women to ask, what is that bat house? Is that an owl house? How did you bring an owl here? How did you bring a hawk here? Why are you leaving these wildflowers to grow? Where's this monarch butterfly coming from? Why are you burning the crops using a flamethrower? I wanted to bring what I had sojourned myself and traveled for to learn it and bring it back to women and allow them to design that space for themselves. So think about what brought all of us there. What were these women looking for? They didn't own the house. They did not own the land. I'm often as crazy as a bed bug, but what was the relationship that brought them into that space with Department of Neighborhood Development? That brought men, women, and children out there with their shovels and doing a very historic thing rooted in community, a farm raising. Those little girls, the Tuskegee interns that were out there who actually were big animal science majors in their pink shoes. So what were they trying to do? And what could have been done if they would have the advocacy to see it to its full fruition? And how were we all in allyship and an accomplishment, not towards just Black women having access to land, based on their deserving right historically and generationally, and decompressing from the violence of this country, where we're flag as people, there's nowhere for us to go. This is it, right? There's no vacation to go back to Brazil or to Colombia or to Latin America. We are intrinsically connected to that American flag. But what were they trying to do? And that's the bigger conversation, because in that conversation, we talk about my unease with how many women were opening up cans of corn. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how many women were not just feeding their children canned corn coming from South America on trucks, on ships. We're also talking about the nutritional deficits of their children who are going to school and what that means for their participation in their education. We're talking about where that can goes. What happens to that trash? Are we throwing away a can, or are we composting the husk off of a corn that was picked out of a bed on the farm site? So what were they trying to do? And what was Kafi's understanding of this work? And how did racism and bias and marginalization prevent that? And my last thought is, as I said to James recently, I'll be honest, I was like, I'm so pissed. I was like, I'm so pissed. And I keep saying to people, like, I mean, I'm not a huge meat consumer. And there are pictures, if you ask me for the pictures, there are pictures, and people still marginalization of this project and their lack of support. A lot of foundations, they have no idea that we were able to create a full calorie diet on that site of organic chickens that we dispatched so that the women could understand what it is to kill an animal for your consumption. Think about it. How many legs go in, how many bodies of chickens go into a Popeye's meal? And how do we honor that animal? And now how we open the carcass of the animal to come out with corn and tomatoes, which the roosters were eating themselves off of the farm site. And that's what was in that chicken's body, right? The honey from the honeybees and all of the vegetables. So we were able to pull together a full calorie diet. So what was the possibility for a full calorie diet that was zero waste? And how many women, 12 women standing out there with me, and understand what was possible on that less than a third acre in the heart of Dorchester. And no one's bothered to ask, because I feel like if they ask, they own it. This is why I respect the council. No one's bothered to ask, what are you trying to do out here? And if they did, they would get the pictures of women in the evening sharing dinners. They would get the pictures of women building beds, women digging soil, full calorie diets, what it meant to dispatch a chicken. And they would get the long-term intention of incorporating women into their environment, into the climate, into waste, and into our overall resilience as a society.
Oh, thank you, Kafi. Thank you.
I guess I would just say something very brief, and that's that as a filmmaker, and as I step back and look at what happened over those 5 years and how the film evolved and how Kafi and Carl became collaborators with me on the filmmaking. And what I saw in terms of something I would never have witnessed if I hadn't had this experience of knowing Kafi and becoming friends with her and being able to understand what she was just expressing. And I hope that the film, I think film is a powerful medium. I think that we've had, a year of screenings of the film all over the country, and the response has been very gratifying. I think that the film is sort of an access to some really difficult issues that people sometimes just want to set aside and not think about. And I think that in terms of the larger environmental question, when we look at the sort of overheated development in Boston, not only is it environmentally very iffy, but it's also, the policies around it are ones that are excluding people like Kafi. And I think that's what Kafi was saying throughout those years when we were making the film, that there was really no transparency in terms of how to access land, how to, for someone like Kafi and people from a neighborhood who wanted to do something, so admirable and something that it seems like no one could argue with from any political stripe. Why is it that it was so impossible for them to do it? Why were these obstacles there? And why couldn't the city be open enough to see what Kafi just described?
It wasn't, and the funny thing about it wasn't just the city. I encourage you to continue to watch the documentary because everybody says that I take more away from it. What was the challenge to purchasing a cow? What was the challenge to raising a cow? You know how hard it was for me to get 6, 7, 8 women onto a farm? And they came because I said, we're going to raise a cow. And forgive me for the vegans and vegetarians. And then I'll take you through the process of slaughtering the cow, dispatching the cow, and sharing meat. The woman showed up to that farm that day, not for the tour, but for the conversation of the cow. And what was the challenge to those farmers pulling back from the conversation? And how did something that happened 4 years ago, how if there was no challenge to that cattle, would we have a different way of looking at resiliency through COVID and through inflation? If those women had the ability to know how to go to other farms and purchase their food from those farmers, would women be standing there at the supermarket looking at beef that had skyrocketed to $18 a pound to feed their family? Never mind that it's not even organic or high quality. So when I say I'm pissed, I was just like, we were trying to do things from the farming to the cows, to the center in the community, to the health, that would have directly informed a national conversation about resilient communities and resiliency in not just the environment, but health. But because there were so many challenges based on race and class and culture, that conversation has not been had yet. But we are determined in this work, I am determined in this work, to bring that conversation forward the same way we did with the farm site.
And hopefully we can help you do that.
Kafi, do you want to just say briefly what lies ahead for the co-op and for your work?
Oh yeah, I'm a visual person, so I keep thinking of Fife will go west. I'm a little mouse, trying to go west. What's ahead is that, and if anybody knows of any farmers or growers, I'm trying to transition out of the urban farm project. That literally was a stop in my life. It wasn't my intention to stay there. I always knew I was moving to a more rural community to and understand that there are rural communities of POC, but in those rural communities of POC, how are we creating the space for urban communities, urbanite communities to come in there with all of their oppression and their baggage and decompress without being judged? You know, how are we creating space? Can I create space for women where it's okay for them to wear their lashes and their earrings as we talk about, hey, let's get up and do a sun salutation in the morning, you know, to Kendrick Lamar, and to make it okay for their sons, for their daughters, for the children of their fathers to come as they are and participate in these spaces we participate in. So if anybody knows of a farmer or grower who's interested in a residency program on the farm this summer, I am looking for a farmer so that I can begin my intentions of looking for land in Western Mass or Lower Vermont, to start creating this community where, again, come as you are and decompress and leave that baggage. And let's have real conversations about how we are included in these larger global conversations. So that's it, just to finish the farm site and to hand the farm site. I am handing the farm site and the land over to the woman. So my intention is, and nobody's talking about, not that I need them to talk about either, what it will be to gift a property and a home to women, because my job there is done. It wasn't my intention, but it happened. It's here. This is yours as part of a co-op. And to talk about that, we're an equity-based co-op in function and not in name. So to continue to grow the co-op, to try to find funding, to bring in staffing, because there still is an education gap around the agriculture and around the administrative work. So the only thing that's keeping me there on the project is still that the city is refusing to enter into conversations about me purchasing the land without becoming a charity, which a charity doesn't own anything in the state of Massachusetts. They're not allowed to own anything as a 501c3. So, and we refuse to become a 501c3 because the women do need to participate in political process as voters and be re-engaged in the democratic process. So I don't know if we can do that as a C3, maybe as a C4, but as a C4, we still wouldn't be allowed to purchase the land according to the conversations the cities have had thus far. So I will be going, I am looking for land to purchase and to create space for women and myself as safe space, inclusionary space. Because if they don't want us, then give us the resources to leave. That's also something that just bothers me to no end. If you say that there's not enough space for us in Boston, as the census says, the African-American community is the only demographic in the city of Boston consistently being lost, then how are you creating a space for us to go somewhere and to build community there, a new and brighter community that's more embedded in the conversations that we all want to have? So that's what's going forward. We're trying to find funding to train administrative staff, to bring in a farmer. And this project is meant to be self-sustained. We're not supposed to exist off of, I'll be damned. We are not going to exist off of funding solely. The women need to understand how to do this work and their families, how to do this work in autonomy and solidarity and with hard work and a model that can provide them the autonomy to speak out politically as well.
Oh, thank you, Kafi. Thank you, James. Thank you, Melissa, also. Melissa, did you have anything you wanted to add? Yeah, to be continued, to be continued. And you've given us so much to think about. And
thank you so much to both of you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
know you are going to breakfast, Kafi. James, if you want to join a group, you're welcome to join. So it's up to you. Okay. We're going to take a break right now, and we're going to take a 5-minute break, and everybody will be put into breakout groups, and we'll come back at 10 after 12. Okay.
Okay. And I very quickly want to remind everyone that the Reckoning is airing tomorrow night on PBS, on Independent Lens.
Yes.
So check your local listings. But you've seen the film, but maybe tell your friends to tune in.
And it'll be up for a month or so, James?
Yeah, it'll be airing, and then it'll be streaming on the PBS site for 30 days.
30 days.
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody spread the word.
Yeah. And the next iteration of the reckoning is to continue to hold these conversations. The conversations have been very important. James and I's presence in the conversation, or allowing to unpack the documentary. So we foresee ourselves being able to bring the women in more of the panels like Tolga, and to hear their perspective, because I'm not the sole voice of their experiences, but to connect their experiences to communities that are actually concerned and being resolution-based about how we approach this work. So we will have conversations and provide speakers workshops. So if you feel in the future to bring women like Tolga and Joanna back, and some other women that are working within the project, we're open for that as well.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you both again.
Thank you.
And everybody hang on for another 5 minutes and we'll turn into council groups. It's so special to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, Sarah, Melissa.
Bye. Bye, Kafi. Talk soon.
Bye.